Okay, so today we're really diving into this idea of a mental health crisis in Gen Z. And you've brought us these excerpts from Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation. And honestly, it's kind of freaky, right?
Yeah.
Like, one of the things that struck me right away is that he's coming at this not just as like a researcher, but as a professor who's seeing these changes firsthand in his students.
Right.
And that's got to be pretty eye-opening.
Yeah, I mean, what's really fascinating about the book is that he backs up a lot of those firsthand observations with some pretty startling data.
Yeah.
He points to, for example, this very sharp rise in depression, self-harm among teenagers, especially girls. And it all seems to start, like, he really points to this date, around 2012.
That's what got me, too. Is like,
Yeah.
It's easy to think, oh, things were already tough back then. You know, the recession was pretty fresh. We were still dealing with, like, the after effects of 9/11. Like, why this sudden decline right then?
Yeah, and he really tackles that head on. It's like, hold on a second. Those events were huge.
Right.
But they don't quite match up with when things really seem to take a nosedive for Gen Z's mental health.
Okay.
For example, he points out that millennials were actually hit harder by the recession, like financially, but their mental health doesn't seem to have plummeted in the same way.
Interesting.
And then, you know, climate change anxieties have been brewing for decades, right? So that's not a new stressor, really.
Right. Okay, so if it's not those things, then what is he pointing to?
Yeah.
What was so different about the early 2010s?
Well, he really points to, I mean, it's kind of, in some ways, it's obvious in retrospect, but 2 words, smartphones.
Okay.
So between like 2010 and 2015,
Yeah.
you know, they go from kind of a novelty to practically everyone has one, especially teenagers.
Right.
And suddenly the internet, social media, gaming, it's all in their pockets 24/7.
It's true.
And he has this phrase, the great rewiring of childhood. Because Gen Z is the first generation to really hit puberty with that level of digital immersion.
Wow.
He even says, he has this great line, he says, it's like they're the first generation raised on Mars.
Growing up on Mars, that really kind of hits home. But how does that translate to this anxiety and depression that we're seeing? Like, what's the actual link?
So this is where I think it's really interesting because he dives into how essential play is for kids.
Especially what he calls risky play. You know, the stuff that teaches them to handle challenges, to bounce back from falling off their bikes, literally.
Yeah.
And he kind of breaks it down into these like 6 categories.
Okay.
There's heights, speed, using tools, being out in the elements, rough housing,
right,
and even just like disappearing,
like wandering off and exploring on their own.
Exactly.
God, that really takes me back. Like climbing trees, disappearing for hours on end. God, I don't see kids doing that as much anymore.
And that's exactly his point. He's saying by taking away these experiences, we're not letting kids build up that resilience. It's like they're going into the real world without ever having skinned their knees.
Right.
So, of course, they're more likely to freak out when things get tough.
Right. And then he connects this to the rise of safetyism, you know, that overprotective parenting style.
Right. Right.
And he argues that might actually be making kids more emotionally vulnerable in the long run.
That's kind of a mind-blowing thought. So we've removed this real-world risk, but we've replaced it with this constant online connection. So what does he say about how that affects kids' development?
So he outlines what he sees as these 4 major harms that come from this, like always-on connectivity.
Okay. This is where it gets interesting. Hit me with it.
And some of them are kind of unexpected.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, the first one that I think really landed hard for me is this idea that social media, especially those image-based platforms like Instagram, you know, might be even more harmful to girls than boys.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the constant comparisons, the pressure to look perfect, all the drama.
Exactly. And he's arguing it's not just about like feeling bad. It's actually changing the way girls see themselves and relate to each other at like a really fundamental level.
Right.
And this all kind of ties into, you know, his bigger point about the decline of what he calls the play-based childhood, you know?
Interesting. So take me back to the good old days. What exactly does he mean by that, a play-based childhood, and how did we lose it?
So he basically says that for most of human history, kids just spent most of their time in this like free, unstructured play.
Yeah.
You know, exploring the woods, building forts, playing tag, all with very minimal adult supervision. And he's not just being nostalgic here. He really makes this argument that there are these like deep evolutionary reasons why play is how kids learn, you know, these crucial social and cognitive skills.
So it's not just about burning off energy. It's actually like how their brains are wired to develop.
Exactly. He even talks about how play, especially that risky play we were talking about, helps kids build something he calls anti-fragility.
Anti-fragility.
Which is basically this ability to not just withstand stress, but to actually get stronger from it.
Oh.
Like a muscle, if you never challenge it, it's not going to grow.
So like a vaccine, a little exposure builds immunity.
Yes, exactly. A little bit of risk and challenge early on actually helps them handle the bigger stuff later. But he's saying that instead we're creating this, he calls it this like experience blocker for kids. We overschedule them, we overprotect them, we keep them glued to screens. So it's like the great rewiring, right? We've gone from a play-based childhood to this phone-based childhood.
It's true. It does seem like kids today just have way less free time than ever. Like, why? Why are we keeping them on such a tight leash?
So he points to a bunch of factors. I think one of the big ones is fear.
Okay.
He talks about how the media tends to focus on these like very worst case scenarios like child abductions and stuff.
Yeah.
And so even though like statistically those things are still extremely rare,
right,
it creates this perception that the world is like way more dangerous than it actually is.
I get it. As a parent, it's really easy to get sucked into those worst case scenarios,
Oh, totally. And he's not trying to blame parents at all, but he's saying that this safetyism has kind of gone too far by trying so hard to protect kids from like every bump in the road.
Yeah.
We might actually be making them more fragile and anxious in the long run.
Wow. That's kind of a mind-blowing thought. So we've talked about the problem, right? Like this decline of play, the rise of smartphones, but like, what does he suggest we do about it? Like, is there any way to actually reverse course on this?
Yeah. So he does, and he doesn't sugarcoat it. He's like, this is going to take a collective effort.
Right.
He has this whole section called the Playbook for Change.
Okay.
And he kind of breaks it down into what governments, tech companies, schools, and yes, parents can do.
Yeah. Okay, so let's unpack those a little bit. What are some of the key plays in this playbook? Okay, so we've got like the playbook, right? We're going to start with the big players, I guess, governments, tech companies. What kind of action is he calling for there?
Well, he really sees governments as having a huge role to play in, like protecting kids online.
Okay.
And one of his big pushes is raising the age of what he calls internet adulthood.
Okay, so you mean like how old you'd have to be to have a social media account?
Exactly.
Which is like 13 now, right?
13, yeah. And he's basically saying that's way too young.
Okay.
Especially given what we now know about like how the adolescent brain develops and all that. And he wants to see it raised to like at least 16, more in line with like the original intent of that law when it was passed.
16, yeah, that makes sense. But how do you even like enforce something like that? I mean, kids can easily lie about their age online, right?
Right. And he has an answer for that too, which is he calls it device-based age verification.
Okay.
So it would be basically a system where like parents could designate their kids' devices as belonging to a minor.
Right.
Which would then trigger like age restrictions across all platforms.
So it's like a digital ID card that's like, hey, this user's under 16, watch out.
Exactly. It puts parents like back in the driver's seat.
Right.
Gives them a lot more control over what their kids can access.
Okay, but there's always that counter argument about like too much regulation is going to stifle innovation and make the internet less free and all of that.
Yeah, and he totally addresses that head on.
Really?
He's not against freedom, but he's saying it's about finding the right balance.
Sure.
Like we already have age restrictions on things like alcohol and tobacco to protect young people.
Right.
Why not online too?
Right. It's true.
And he points to like the UK, for example, they have something called the Age-Appropriate Design Code.
Okay.
They're actually doing this, and it seems to be working without, like, killing innovation or anything.
Interesting. So there are models out there.
Yeah.
Now, what about, like, the tech companies themselves, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're the ones building these platforms. So what's his message to them?
Well, he's basically challenging them to, like, rethink their whole model.
Okay.
Because right now, it's all about engagement, right? It's like, how do we keep users glued to their screens for as long as possible? And he's saying we need to move beyond that and start designing for well-being instead.
Okay, so less like that addictive slot machine in your pocket and more like What?
Yeah.
What would that even look like?
Right. Well, it could be things like, building in features that actually like promote healthier tech habits. Like
Right.
imagine apps that actually encouraged you to take breaks
Right.
or like nudged you towards more like mindful content or something. He also talks about like giving users more control over their data,
Yeah.
being more transparent about how those algorithms work.
Yeah, I think we could all appreciate a little more transparency there, but it does feel like those companies are so focused on, like, the bottom line. I don't know how realistic it is to expect them to change.
It's a huge challenge, no doubt, but I think ultimately he is optimistic.
Yeah.
He believes that if enough people demand change, consumers, parents, even like investors, that these companies will have to listen.
Okay, so we've got government setting boundaries. We've got tech companies, like, stepping up their game. What about schools? What can they do?
Yeah, he really sees schools as being like absolutely essential for pushing back against this like phone-based childhood that we're talking about. He's a big proponent of like phone-free schools, at least during school hours. He argues that phones are just too distracting and removing them allows kids to actually focus on learning and interacting with each other in the real world.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, it's hard enough for adults to resist the pull of their phones, let alone like a middle schooler.
Exactly. He also wants to see schools bring back more like unstructured playtime, like recess, after school programs, that kind of thing.
Right.
And not just any kind of play. He really emphasizes like the kind of free exploratory play.
Right.
That allows kids to take risks, to be creative, to like figure things out for themselves.
So less organized sports and like structured activities and more just letting kids be kids.
Exactly. And he even highlights this like really cool program called the Let Grow Project. It's all about like encouraging schools to give kids more independence and responsibility.
I love that.
Which helps them build that anti-fragility that we were talking about earlier. So
Right. But realistically, schools are already stretched so thin, like, how are they supposed to find the time and resources for all of this?
he acknowledges that it's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
But I think he believes that it really comes down to priorities,
Sure.
Like, do we want schools that prioritize test scores above all else? Or do we want schools that nurture the whole child?
It's a good question.
He's really asking us to, like, rethink what's truly important for our kids' development,
Okay, so far we've covered governments, we've covered tech companies, we've covered schools. But let's be honest, a lot of this really comes down to us, the parents.
Yeah,
Absolutely. So what's his message to parents?
He actually devotes a whole chapter to parents.
Okay.
And it's full of like really practical advice. And I think his like number one piece of advice might be the hardest one to swallow, which is delay giving your child a smartphone.
He's not just talking about limiting screen time. He's saying, like, hold off on a smartphone altogether.
Ideally, yes, at least until high school.
Well,
he argues that those early years are just so crucial for developing real world social skills, attention span, resilience, all the things that, excessive screen time can really undermine.
I know he's right, but that is a tough sell for a lot of parents.
Oh, totally.
Like, there's so much pressure to give kids phones, especially once they hit middle school and all that.
He gets that. He really does. And he actually talks about how it's another one of those collective action problems. It's like, even if individual parents want to hold off, they feel like they can't because everyone else is doing it,
Right. So how do we break out of that cycle then?
Well, he says it starts with like connecting with other like-minded parents, Find your people, build a community, and support each other in like making that different choice.
I love that there's power in numbers, right?
Absolutely. And he also, I think, importantly reminds parents how important it is for us to like model those healthy tech habits ourselves.
Oh, that's a good point.
Right. We can't exactly tell our kids to put down their phones if we're like constantly glued to ours.
Oh, yeah, that one hits close to home.
Right. So it's really about, being mindful, setting boundaries, making sure that we're prioritizing those like real world experiences for ourselves and our kids.
So it all boils down to that, really. Like,
Yeah.
if you had to pick one thing from this playbook that really resonated with you, what would it be?
I think for me, it's this idea of shifting our mindset from protection to preparation. Instead of trying to shield kids from every risk and challenge, we need to actually give them the tools and the experiences they need to actually navigate the world.
Yeah.
Bumps, bruises, and all. It's not about going back to the good old days.
Right.
It's about creating a new kind of childhood.
Right.
That's both connected and resilient, tech-savvy, and earthbound.
I love that. Preparation over protection. That's a really powerful message. It gives me a lot to think about, both as someone who, works with young people and just as like a human being in this crazy tech-saturated world. So to our listeners out there, what will you do to bring childhood back down to earth?